G'day folks, and welcome to this preliminary review of A Time for Trumpets. This was published by GMT Games in 2020. It was designed by Bruno Sinigaglio, who was also involved in Battle of the Bulge 81 by Avalon Hill and the Bitterwoods Designer Edition published by Compass Games. Let me say, in a nutshell, this is a monster game. It is huge. It is one of the biggest games I've ever played. I will say that I have not played the campaign game through to completion. I have only played a small part of the campaign game and about parts of 5 other smaller scenarios. One through to completion and one almost through to completion. So take all this with a grain of salt. This is why I'm calling this a sort of preliminary review, because I can't comment in full on how the campaign game plays out. The reason for that is because this is a monster game. I've invested probably close to 40 hours of gameplay into those campaigns and scenarios. That's just gameplay, not considering rules, digestion, and reading and studying and so forth. So I'm about 40 hours into these various scenarios. It is, as I said, a monster game. It covers the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive at battalion scale. Most of these units are battalions. There are a few smaller companies and other units. Hexes are about 1 mile across, and you're looking at the full bulge in the Ardennes region. It is a 5-map game, but there are many scenarios that you can set up on just one map on the far eastern side of operations. There are also some later scenarios that start midway through the campaign. The full campaign runs from the morning of the 16th of December through to the evening on the 26th of December. So in effect an 11-day campaign. But of course there are typically 4 turns in a day, and each turn is about 6 hours long. You have 2 daylight turns, a morning and an evening turn, morning and an afternoon turn, and there are 2 night turns, an evening turn and then a pre-dawn turn to start the day. This is fundamentally an I go, you go system. You have a mutual player segment where both players perform administrations such as checking air, power, supply and command. Then you have 2 individual player segments, a German player segment where in effect the German player conducts movement and combat primarily, along with other administrative functions like repairing bridges, preparing defensive positions and so forth. And then there's a brief mutual end of play turn segment where you conduct administration and the turn advance a turn marker. The fundamentals of gameplay are will be fairly familiar to many gamers. That units have a movement factor, and you can move up to that movement allowance. There are combat factors, and you bring multiple units into combat, add up their combat factors, compare those with the defenders' combat factors to determine an odds ratio, and then you roll on a relatively standard combat results table to determine the outcomes, such as defender retreats, a step loss, or attacker retreats, things like that. The rules are 64 pages long, but in effect there are 50 pages of rules with about 14 pages of examples of play at the end. However, don't let the 50 pages sort of intimidate. The rulebook is structured in a manual format to follow the sequence of play, and this makes it great for consulting rules. So on page 3 of the rulebook you have all those steps in the sequence of play laid out as you encounter them in the game. So if you ever need to consult a rule and you're at step 16 of the sequence of play, you can simply go to step 16 of the rulebook. Because of this structure, the rules are quite repetitive. We have the same. You have battalions. You'll occasionally have brigades and Kampfgruppen. Then mainly you'll have divisions above that. And these divisions are part of a corps, and those corps are part of armies. And you'll often find the same rules for a unit at division level repeated for units at corps echelon level, and then repeated again for units at army echelon level. Because of that, there is a lot of repetition. There's also repetition for things like administration and construction. So, for example, the rules mention that when building an improved position 5, units must be in communication, in supply, and active. And then the next section is when building improved position 6, units must be in supply, in command, and active. And the next section of the rulebook is when constructing a strong point, units must be in supply, in command, and active. Now you could simplify this by saying to construct a defensive position, units must be in supply, in command, and active. And it covers all these situations, but it's repeated throughout all those sections, which adds to the length of the text. As a result, you can really skim through a lot of this. I've done some primer videos which just run for about an hour 10. And if you watch through those, you'll get a sense of the fundamentals of gameplay. The rulebook itself, there is very little that will surprise experienced gamers. There is little confusing or complex within the standard rulebook. What makes this game complex is the 4 play aid charts that come with the game. And these play aid charts are, in effect, 4 A4 pages each. There are 4 of these, so you're looking at 4 times 4, 16 pages of charts to go with the game. The reason these make the game complex is because they alter the rules based on various game states. I'll talk about that in a moment. But you read the rules, you understand that units can move up to their movement factor. But their movement factor varies depending on what the cost to move into terrain really varies depending on a range of factors. Things like whether it's whether there is traffic in a particular region of the board that applies to a certain army on particular turns. Things like weather effects affect the cost to move into terrain, or atmospheric conditions may affect the cost to move along roads. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but it is one of the main things complicating gameplay, because every time you go to move a unit, you need to pause and think about all these factors that may apply to the movement. Is there traffic? Am I in the area where traffic is applied? Does this apply to this type of unit? Are they moving along a road, and what are the atmospheric conditions that apply to those road movements? What are the other weather effects if I decide to move off-road, and how does it apply to this particular type of unit, whether it's a foot unit, truck movement, horse-drawn artillery, things like that. And then, complicating it further, is the variable zone of control effect. So enemy units exert zones of control, but different units exert zones of control into different terrains. They don't always exert zones of control. So, of course, headquarters and artillery don't typically exert zones of control. AFVs don't exert zones of control into marshes. Infantry do exert zones of control into marshes, unless it's foggy, or a night turn, or there's dense fog or snow. You need to be aware of all those variable and changing zone of control effects, and it just complicates everything and slows everything down. These charts and the many footnotes to conditions and exceptions to conditions are the game's greatest complicating factor. And it does take, it's been the biggest part of the learning curve, is being mindful of the various effects that may apply. So when you're moving through along a road, you're not just considering normal off-road movement on the normal road movement chart, you're considering the various atmospheric conditions. You might also need to consider traffic jams on the traffic jam chart. You may need to consider enemy zones of effects that impact that road, and even if you just move off that road briefly, you'll need to consider the off-road movement chart. And again, these various conditions. There may be air interdiction in the area. There may be other effects as well. A lot of people have commented on the detailed exceptions to rules within this game. So whenever you set up a scenario, you'll consult the setup charts. It's a good idea to print these off, and when you're setting up, every unit will have instructions for mainly when they are active, when you can actually move with that unit. Units in green, you can see the green bars here, they are typically active from the morning of the 16th, from the very first turn onwards. Units in yellow become active from the afternoon on the 16th onwards. That is relatively easy to grasp. Some units are free, relatively small number of units on that first turn on the morning of the 16th, more units become available. It becomes more complex when units are given specific instructions. So they may be told that when they're active, they must move through certain areas. They must move through certain towns en route to another town before they're then free to move wherever they want. Or they may be told that they have to, engineers in particular, are told that they have to work at constructing certain bridges until that bridge is complete, and they can't do anything else until that time. So there might be specific instructions that you need to apply and adhere to for specific units. And given there are thousands of units in this game, this can be a lot of administration to keep track of, even in the smaller scenarios. So that's another thing slowing it down. I didn't find that overly complicating. It's not difficult to look at these charts and see what's going on. It just it's something to administer. That's that. This is also coupled with specific instructions for units and formations within all the sort of army areas for the various scenarios. So divisions might be given specific instructions that they need to move to certain areas or do certain things or begin with certain rested markers or are attached to other formations. That also complicates things a little bit, but it's really just the administration of those things that makes it difficult. It's all there within the scenario book. The scenario book, incidentally, is 60 pages long. There are many different scenarios. You've got short 7-turn, slightly longer 11-turn. We've got scenarios that, endgame scenarios that sort of advance the time a little bit and set up during, for example, the Battle for Bastogne and beyond and so forth. You've also got the Play Aid book. And this covers some more additional rules. It covers the reinforcement charts, it covers the step loss charts, it covers the random events. So whenever you activate a core, you roll a random event for that core, you can salt the table to see what happens, and it throws some sort of chaos into the mix. So when you, as I said, it's an IGO system, the German play goes, they perform their movement in combat, and the American play goes. On the German turn, they begin by activating an army, and when you're doing the smaller army focus scenarios, you're typically activating just the one army, the 5th Panzer Army or the 7th Army. Once you have an army activated, you begin to activate all the corps within that army. So if you're looking at the 7th Army, you might activate the 85th Corps, you'll roll for their random event. Once that corps is active, you move the divisions within that corps, or rather the battalions of the divisions within that corps. So if you activate the 85th Corps of the 7th Army down the south, you might activate the 5th Fallschirmjäger division, and you'll activate all the battalions. And this is your focus in terms of gameplay. A turn is 6 hours long. Foot units typically have 6 movement points, but of course, in the early scenarios, there are Americans all over the place, dispersed companies and battalions, and you can't move very far, particularly with the move cost. If you move into, let's say, wooded terrain on a fog turn, for example, that's 4 out of your 6 movement factors. If you're crossing a river with a foot unit, it's an additional, I believe, 2 movement factors to cross that river. If you're moving into broken terrain in fog, it's 3 movement factors. So you're typically not moving very far through this off-road terrain. So your infantry at the start is moving maybe 1 or 2, 3 hexes if they're lucky. If they're following a road, and there's usually Americans on those roads, they might be able to move a little bit further, but again, there are typically Americans on those roads, blocking those roads, preventing that movement. So this is your focus. You're focused on moving these battalions around, and it is almost sort of grand operational, grand tactical in your thinking. You are certainly So you're moving every battalion, and you're trying to get that battalion to engage with enemy forces, occupying key objectives, perhaps. And when I say objectives, these are personal objectives. What do you want to do with this division and corps? So you're thinking sort of grand tactically on this battalion scale about where you want to move this division and corps, and how you're going to crack open, particularly in the early scenarios, the American defenders and their defensive positions. So you're thinking, where are the key river crossings, bridges, or fords? Where are the key roads leading out of here, leading to open ground? You're thinking about perhaps where can you surround Americans? You're thinking about sort of, those small, you're thinking about tactics on a divisional scale to facilitate the moving and advancement of a division beyond these American positions. Because your infantry is not moving very far, 2-3 hexes with their 6, 7, or 8 combat movement factors, it becomes a bit of a grind, a slow rolling grind. So as the German offensive begins, the infantry just shuffles up a little bit further. They can't move far, 1 or 2 hexes if they're lucky. The first turn, it's basically most of the battalions are moving from 1 hex. And then it's a 6-hour turn. So that's all that's happened in 6 hours. After 40 rough hours of gameplay, it is taking me roughly about 2 hours to do all the movement and combat for an entire German army. So if I'm playing through a 7th Army scenario right now, and it's taking me about 2 hours to do all the 7th Army divisions, corps, movement and combat. The Americans are a bit quicker because they have fewer forces on the board. I was much slower when I first started playing, so I'm getting a bit quicker. But to bring me back to my point, you're moving these units small distances, 1 or 2 hexes, then you're engaging in combat, and for the first turn, combat is quite difficult for the Germans. They have to sort of slowly pick apart these fortified Americans in their sort of dispersed forts. So it's a slow grind, and then the next turn, the 16th afternoon, it's another little slow grind where they get a couple of, maybe 1 or 2 movement points if they've been lucky. Sometimes they're just stationary and they're attacking the same fortifications, trying to grind them down, trying to just get 1 hit or 1 retreat result. By the 16th evening turn, many units are still in the same place, and they're butting their heads against these American defences. So this is a slow grinding push to against these American defences. Gradually you'll begin to see cracks start to show, and the Germans will try to exploit those cracks, and they'll look for these weak points, and so you begin to get greater movement, and you'll start to open up these roads, and your AFVs and trucks will start to shift towards that direction, and you'll start to look for more opportunities, and gradually these opportunities begin to expand. But by this stage, by the morning of the 17th, you're 4 turns in, 24 hours into the battle, and this has taken about 12 hours of gameplay, roughly. That's where I'm at right now. So it's a very slow, grinding experience of the Battle of the Bulge. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that is how detailed this game is. Now, I have to say from the start, this is one of the most well-researched conflict simulations or war games on a historical subject that I've ever encountered. And I've played a lot of the Love a Tale games. I've played with the Marie-Louise and the Regs 30 rules. I've played Battles of the Age of Reason. I've played ASL, not much. But this game is meticulously well researched. Bruno has done an amazing job and the design team. It's not just Bruno, there's others as well. Huge credit to the playtesters who playtested this. An amazing job in conducting research behind this design to create that historical situation in December 1944, to place units where they were, to get a sense of the impacts of different units in different situations, to understand the impact of fog and dense fog and snow squalls, and terrain and roads and bridges, and how long it took the Germans to construct bridges, how long it took different types of engineers to construct different types of bridges, the impact of fords and all these things. I could go on for a long time about all the detail in these charts that are all reflect the research behind this design. So I'll admit, when I first started playing this, it was a pretty frustrating experience. There was a lot of this bookkeeping, a lot of administration to keep in mind. And that was even before I started sort of realising how deep the player aid charts are, how complex these can be in terms of all the modifiers to movement and all the modifiers to combat. You can bring engineers into combat and they provide a beneficial modifier for you unless they're attacking across a river. Or you can do a flank attack if you have 3 or more units flanking an enemy position, unless one of those, you need to have 3 units not attacking across a river. You can do combined arms, but you only get the benefits if you're in clear or I believe wooded terrain. Certain formations like the 2nd Panzer Division, so night combat is punitive to the attacker generally, but of course some formations like the 2nd Panzer Division receive a particular benefit on night attacks, so they have additional modifiers that you need to keep in mind. And there are all these other little quirks of these effects that have, that you need to keep in mind, that you learn and need to harness to make the most of your attacks. And early on, before you kind of really appreciate all these things, it does seem quite messy and chaotic, and there's just so much going on, and I've made a lot of mistakes. I mentioned I played 5 scenarios, 1 to completion, another one almost at completion. I've got the big campaign, and then 3 failed at various points of playthrough when I realised I was just playing movement rules critically wrong. At one point I forgot about traffic jams, so units were moving around freely. At another point I think I'd misplayed the dense fog rules and had been misplaying it for a while, so I just decided to restart because the Germans were too far ahead. And that kind of adds to the frustration. It's part of the learning curve, but it adds to the frustration that this game presents early on as you're learning it. The learning curve is huge. The long-term payoff after 40 hours is a game that really conveys a sense of accurately recreating the situation in the Ardennes in December 44. If that's what you want, if you're looking for the most accurate representation of the Ardennes offensive, check out A Time for Trumpets, because this is where it's at. Conversely, if you are looking for a fast, rapid game where you bust out the bulge, I'd encourage you to look elsewhere. Something like Ardennes 44 or even Last Blitzkrieg. They both focus your attention on breaking out and rapid road movement, and they move at a much faster pace. Another limiting factor here, another thing that deters that feeling of that open breakout. You do have breakouts, but they are slow breakouts. They happen very slowly, partly because of the 6 hour limit on turns. 1 turn in A Time for Trumpets, as I said, is 6 hours long, and you can certainly break out, and the Americans may struggle to rally and cover these roads. The Germans may conduct an overrun to eliminate an American unit, open the path for more Germans to burst through. But then, because there's only a 6 hour limit and their movement is relatively limited, they're often quite quickly contained. So 6 hours, these 6 hour turns don't provide the Germans with the time to do a lot. So within the space of a turn, as I said before, they're kind of pushing up to the lines, they're attacking, and that's it. And then you have to wait for the next turn to do another attack. Of course, each enemy hex can only be attacked once per corps. There are rules, however, and this is quite an interesting opportunity to exploit, where a defensive position, an American defensive position, can only be attacked once per corps. But that means that once one core has attacked that hex, a different core can potentially activate and move in to attack the same hex. And this can be very helpful for facilitating exploitation. If one core can weave their way in to attack that hex, if they can eliminate the defenders or force retreat, it means that a different core, or the division of a different core, can come along and potentially move through there and take advantage of that earlier attack. So core can cooperate in a sense. Now, I will do a separate comparison video with last Blitzkrieg. There's a lot to talk about in terms of how they feel differently. But one thing I want to point out is that you need to retain unit cohesion. Last Blitzkrieg does this through coordination and mixed effects on your snafu roll. A Time for Trumpets does this through strict rules preventing coordination and mixing of core. You are not allowed, you're literally not allowed to move units of one core through the units of another. They can't stack, they can't move through, they can't mix. And this forces you to keep the divisions as a blob. It's a strict way to enforce it, but it's effective and it keeps your divisions together. And it gets you thinking throughout the game. As I said, you're making a slow grind. It's a slow grind with divisions moving together as a coherent force. So you have the 2nd Panzer Division moving together as a coherent force. The 560th Volksgrenadier Division moving together as a coherent force in a blob, principally because they're not allowed to stack with other divisions. They can't stack with other core. They can't move through units of other core. So it's a very effective way to reinforce divisional cohesion and identity. The additional effect of this is you're trying to provide road networks for these divisions. You want to keep, for example, the 2nd Panzer Division on their road network without interference from neighbouring divisions where there could be chaos and roadblocks. And that inevitably happens. I inevitably have situations where 2nd Panzer has advanced after combat and now they're on the road, and now 560th are trying to come along and they can't get through for whatever reason, or a different corps is trying to come along and they just can't get through that area because units can't mix together at any point. Exception being strategic movement, where units can move through units of other corps. Let me talk about artillery as well. So there are 2 rules you can use here. There's the standard rules where every artillery battalion is represented by a counter. You can also use artillery parks where the Germans can throw all their artillery into these parks. And it offers different things. I like having the artillery on the map. I like to see where they are. I like the idea of manually moving them. It adds to a lot of counter clutter and becomes another administrative burden to have to deal with. But it feels more, I guess, thematic than just having this sort of, I don't have it with me, but the play aid card with the artillery park and all the artillery is just parked there firing. Artillery plays a critical role in combat. You could bring up some attackers for a 10-to-1 combat, and you can throw in your, let's say, 2 artillery battalions to add 8 strength, giving you 18-to-1 odds, and you're thinking this is in the bag, and then the defender throws in 8 artillery combat factors as well, giving the defenders 9, and then you're down to 2-to-1 combat odds. And with terrain, that might be reduced down to, say, 1-to-1, and suddenly you're facing a very difficult combat situation. You've gone from 18-to-1 down to 1-to-1. So careful management of your artillery and selecting when and in what strength to allocate your artillery are some of the most important decisions you'll make in the game. As the attacker, when you're attacking Clervaux, for example, as I was recently doing today, you are throwing every bit of artillery of your corps into that combat, and you're throwing something like 60 combat factors worth of artillery to try to get the best odds. After doing that, incidentally, the final battle that captured Clervaux this afternoon, I think I threw about 70 combat factors. They were halved, reduced, and I only managed to eke out 2-1 odds on the town, which narrowly forced a retreat of the defenders. And by that stage, the Americans had trouble with their artillery behind the lines. They couldn't bring a lot into support their defenders. So this raised the issue of American management of their artillery, placing their particular battalions in the right locations where they can't be threatened by the advancing Germans, keeping them within range of key defendable areas to enable them to provide that artillery support. And of course, using them, American artillery can fire once in the German phase and once in the American phase. German artillery can only fire once throughout the course of a turn. So Americans get 2 shots throughout the turn. But choosing when to fire, particularly American artillery on the defence on the 16th, 17th, 18th of December is a really important decision. Being in the right position, being within range of these defendable areas, and then firing at the right moment, not getting attacked. Tied in with that is air combat, which is another little interesting dynamic to the game. Various turns will offer air units you roll randomly to see what air units you get. They are allocated to corps. The Americans allocate their air to their corps. The Germans allocate their air to their corps. And these can be spent for strafing or ground support missions, and fighters can be used to intercept these types of missions. And strafing missions can basically disrupt artillery, prevent them from firing, which is very effective for the Germans if they can be successful in that. Ground support basically adds ground support combat factors, a lot often of ground support combat factors, and shifts to important combats. And of course, it's this fascinating little interception phase where fighters can come along to intercept this ground support or strafing, and you make an attack roll and a defense roll, and an attack roll and a defense roll, and it's a nice little dynamic that takes place. A bit random and kind of chaotic, but yeah, quite fun and fairly quick to play through. So, as I said, just to recap, it's big. You're looking at the Battle of the Bulge at battalion scale, 1 mile per hex, 6-hour turns. Focus your energy on short-term games. Short-term gains with a view to longer-term operational goals as part of this broad strategy. And yeah, as I said, you're looking at 3 hours per 6-hour turn. You're almost playing this in real time. So that's about 12 hours to play through a day, about 24 hours to play through the shorter scenarios. That's where I'm at the moment. A more experienced player will get a lot quicker. When I first started playing through these scenarios, it was taking me 4+ hours per 6-hour turn, almost at real time. So it's a lot to get through in these scenarios. Playing through the full campaign, starting the full campaign, it is looking at about 7-ish hours per German impulse. That's a 6-hour. So to play through the full front, the 6th Panzer Army, 5th Panzer Army, 7th Army, is taking me 7 hours to perform this 6-hour turn. A turn that reflects 6 hours of the campaign. Again, keeping in mind that's where I'm at after 40 hours of gameplay. That is, I can see it improving, increasing, getting faster, but that's part of that massive learning curve. So I mentioned before, let me return to the play aid cards. As I said, these are the most complicated elements. This makes this game as complex as it is. What's another way to phrase this? This is the biggest learning curve to overcome, because there are so many. Well, these are the combat effects. I highlighted the movement effects earlier, but there are so many effects to be mindful of, and I'm at a point now where I think I feel like I know them all. I feel like I'm incorporating them all into my operations and tactics. I feel like when I'm moving a unit, I'm not just sending a unit up to the front to get combat factors and try to get 2-1. I'm moving my engineers so that they're across the river and can provide a -1 dice roll modifier. Or I'm moving my reconnaissance units so that they're in a position when it's a night turn to provide that additional -1 dice roll modifier. Or I'm moving my units to provide a flanking opportunity, provided that they're all across the river. Or I'm moving my infantry so they can cross the river on the next turn. All these kind of things that I'm at right now that takes a long time to appreciate. And so I'd suggest to anyone learning the game that you spend more time studying these charts than you do reading the rules. The rulebook you'll digest fairly quickly. These charts take time. They can be, there's a lot of sort of notes to be mindful of. There's a lot of conditions, changing conditions. As I said, the ground effects, the atmospheric conditions, the traffic that you need to keep in the back of your mind. That processing of that information. As you're about to move a battalion, you're thinking, is there traffic? Are there any applicable zones of control? Where do they need to be? And will I be able to add their combat factors to this combat the way I want to add? You're moving engineers, for example. If I'm moving them into battle, are they going to be beneficial? Engineers are typically have relatively low combat factors, so are they going to be beneficial? Or should I move just a regular infantry battalion, which has a stronger combat factor? Or should I move my reconnaissance units because it's about to be night turn and I want to get them set up? All these things take time to appreciate. Then you've got defensive positions as well, and defensive positions have various rules depending on what type of defensive positions they are. That also takes time to appreciate. Forts are super effective. They quarter the strength of Nebelwerfers. They halve the strength of all field artillery into their hex. They provide 2 combat shifts to the left, and they ignore a lot of adverse combat effects like mainly counterattacks. They can't be subject to flank attacks. They can't be subject to Stug assaults. All these kind of things that takes time to appreciate. The CRT, rolling dice on the CRT is relatively straightforward. I won't go through that. Typically, either one side or the other retreats, or there's a sort of mixed result in between. There are also combat tactics that you can employ. There are 2 main combat tactics: the Tigers in the Mist combat tactic and the Blitz 44. These in effect are opportunities for you during the combat phase to bounce off a defensive position. So you'll move into attack, but instead of seeking to destroy the defenders in that hex, or seeking to force a retreat of the defenders from that hex, what you're basically saying is, I want to blitz past these units. I want to move past these units. So you're attacking them almost to, in a way, suppress them and then bounce off them and keep moving along a road network, perhaps, provided you don't move into zones of control. Look, there is a heck of a lot more. I could probably go on for a long time about this, but as I said, the main message here is that it's a complex game. The fundamental rules are certainly heavy, but nothing. I felt like I grasped them very quickly. I read the rules. I was like, well, this feels like a standard hex encounter, I go you go system war game. There is nothing too unfamiliar or scary about this. Then you set up a scenario, and this is administration that slows down, makes your first 2 turns quite slow, and it helps to take notes or to have counters, administrative counters that you can place on units to show that they're not moving and things like that. That's administration, but it's not difficult to understand. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of information being presented through the setup charts and the notes and so forth, but it's basically a long list of restrictions on units. It's only really, as I said, once you start moving and when the conditions change and when traffic jams occur, that's when that's when the learning curve really ramps up, and that is, as I said, what makes this the complex game that it is. Bringing this all together to try and capture the feeling of a time for Trumpets. As I said, respect to Bruno for producing just an immensely well-researched and wonderfully designed game. It feels slow, This is not a fast-moving, fast-paced game. It is very slow, 6-hour turns. Typically early on, it's a relatively small movement until you get those breakouts and things start to move more rapidly, and you're using these road networks. And that's when kind of things get exciting, I guess, when you have these breakouts. But it takes a long time to get to that point. So it's a slow, grinding experience of, yeah, sort of grand tactical. I keep saying this, kind of grand tactical thinking. It feels reminiscent in terms of thinking and feeling and bringing units to combat of the Grand Tactical series, which is probably why I enjoy this game so much, because I love GTS. It's almost a similar timescale as well. A turn in GTS is 2 hours. A turn here is 6 hours. And you're looking at battalion scale instead of company scale, of course. But in terms of what you're thinking, in terms of bringing units to the combat, in terms of identifying what units you want to move and how they can get to the combat, you're thinking sort of tactically. But again, with your eye on the long-term operational and strategic objectives, you're thinking about moving these divisions to certain areas and so forth. So look, I hope I've given you some insight into this game. I have very much enjoyed. I'm enjoying it now. It was tough at the start. The first 10 hours were very frustrating and slow. And then things started to accelerate as I appreciated all these different rules. I'm making mistakes along the way, learning as I go. At the point now where things are really rolling, you can check out my live playthroughs. I'm still making some mistakes, still missing some footnotes in these charts. 40 hours in, I can't believe I'm still missing the odd little note here and there, but it's still happening. The final thing I'll say is that there are thousands of counters in this game, and in any given scenario there are hundreds and hundreds of counters, and there's a lot of mix stacking and sorting through counters. The counters are beautiful quality, great GMT production quality. There's just a lot of fiddling with these counters. There's sort of dense areas of concentrated units and artillery and movement, and because of all these restrictions and limitations on unit activation and movement and requirements, I have found the game much more playable on Vassal. So I don't play on Vassal very often, but for both Last Blitzkrieg and A Time for Trumpets, being the big games that they are, I've moved to Vassal. I'm still playing a game on my table, a scenario of this setup, but it moves a lot slower compared to Vassal. Vassal presents the information much more clearly. It's a great module. It helps you manage. You can leave comments on units telling you when they can activate. It's easy to see where units have moved. It's easy to clear the map if you're looking for particular road networks. When you've got hundreds of units in an area, the road networks become difficult to see, and you have to literally pick up all these units to see the critical road networks below them. With Vassal, you can hide all units, see the road network, place all units back on the map, and it's much easier. So for a big footprint game, 5 maps, thousands of counters, 12 counter sheets roughly, I would suggest it would be a struggle for many people to play through the full campaign on their table. So that may be a consideration for you. Are you comfortable playing on Vassal? Are you prepared for the massive administration to set up this game in full, or would you rather go to Vassal? I will say the smaller scenarios focus on roughly a third of one map. They're much more, third to half of a map. They are more manageable. But if you're playing through the full campaign, you've got a lot of units across these maps spread out all over the place, and it's a lot to administer. So just a heads up about that. The Vassal module is great. It's the type of game that moving forward, once I finish this physical scenario, I think that all my future plays of A Time for Trumpets will be on Vassal, simply because of the massive advantages it offers in terms of playability and speed of playability and management of all this information. So final thoughts, final comments. As I said, A Time for Trumpets is immensely heavy and complex. But I would argue it does the best job of capturing the detail of the bulge at that really close scale battalion 6 hour level. For more information on sort of what I'm saying here, I'll do a separate video comparing A Time for Trumpets with the last Blitzkrieg, because the last Blitzkrieg is also battalion scale, but it runs at 1 day per turn, and that time scale is the critical distinction between these two games. But I'll talk about that later in a different video. Folks, again, I hope this has been informative. Thanks for watching. Check it out, A Time for Trumpets by GMT Games. Thanks all. Bye.